At the end of March, the Premier League announced that it would be introducing 5 substitutes from the start of the 2022-23 season, following the recommendations of the International Football Association Board and a vote cast between the 20 Premier League clubs, and breaking from the 3 sub rule which has stood for almost 30 years. It also follows a trend we've seen across Europe since the global outbreak of COVID in 2020, with La Liga, the Bundesliga, Serie A and Ligue all persisting with 5 substitutions from the 2021 campaign onwards. Despite using 5 subs following the previous season's 3-month hiatus, Premier League clubs reverted back to 3 after a motion to carry on with the change was defeated by 11 votes to 9. Unsurprisingly, 6 of the 9 to support the motion were Man City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester United and Tottenham, the richest clubs in the league with the most high quality players at their disposal, backing up the argument that an increase in substitutions disproportionately benefits the big clubs. The issue became a point of contention between Premier League managers, with Jurgen Klopp accusing former Burnley boss Sean Dyche of putting his players' welfare at risk by blocking the move, and arguing that for bigger clubs with more congested schedules, 5 subs is a necessity rather than an advantage. So on today's FD Explained, we're going to take a look at what the Premier League will look like with 5 subs and who will benefit the most. English football being stubborn to change on matters like this is nothing new. Substitutes were introduced to the professional game for the first time in the 1950s during the qualifiers for the 1954 World Cup. In the years following, a number of leagues across Europe adopted this new approach, but it would take until 1965 for the FA to follow suit and allow 1 substitution to be made in case of an injury. And change was gradual from there. It would take another 2 years for the FA to allow substitutions to be made for tactical reasons, and over 20 years before a second substitution was finally brought in 1987 to allow an injured goalkeeper to be replaced by an understudy rather than an outfield player. It wasn't until 1995 that the Premier League clubs were able to use 3 substitutions in a game for any reason, and while the size of benches were gradually getting bigger, going from 3 to 95-96 to 5 in 96-97 to 7 in 2008-09. And with clubs now permanently permitted to name 9 subs after it was initially introduced for Project Restart, until now there has been no change in how many players are allowed to be brought on. In 2015, Peter Bateman wrote in The Guardian that arguments are being advanced in favour of allowing 4 substitutions, and a year later Premier League clubs debated the idea of increasing subs bench from 7 to 9. The global pandemic, which of course forced the suspension of top leagues around the world, kicked off a prolonged period of congested fixtures, brought into greater focus the issue of player welfare, and the International Football Association Board, the organisation that determines the laws of the game, introduced a temporary rule to allow clubs to bring on 5 subs in a game due to these concerns, something they later extended until the end of 2022. This summer they announced the 5 subs would be permanently introduced into the laws of the game, while also stating the clubs could name up to 15 players on the bench at the discretion of the competition organisers. It must also be said that while 5 subs are permitted, managers are still limited to the same amount of stoppages they are allowed to make them in, at half time and on 3 occasions during play, meaning we will never see 5 single subs made at various points during a match. For fans concerned about further stoppages in the game, and there are fair few following the teething problems of VAR, this will come as good news. So now it's here to stay. How will the increase to 5 substitutes affect the Premier League? To begin with, let's address the concerns that will only serve to benefit the big clubs with more expensively assembled squads and punish smaller sides with fewer weapons in their arsenal. These concerns are perfectly valid, especially when you look at examples in years gone by. As ESPN's James Ollie recently touched upon, an FA Cup quarter-final between Norwich and Manchester United in 2020 saw the Red Devils sub on 3 players including Marcus Rashford after they went 1-0 up, and then after conceding an equaliser brought on Nemanja Matic and Paul Pogba, and when the game went to extra time they were able to bring on an additional sub, Anthony Martial, who along with Rashford hit over 20 goals in all competitions that season. In the same game Norwich brought on Onel Hernandez, Tom Tribal, Josip Dermic, Andre Duda and Adam Ida. But while an example like this clearly indicates the gulf in quality between a super rich elite club and a smaller, more thrifty one, it doesn't tell the whole story. If more substitutes benefited the bigger clubs, then we'd likely see those clubs utilise them more often. But as academic and former Athletic Club head of identification Ignacio Palacio Herta wrote at the time, this was not a trend seen in the Bundesliga following its restart in 2020. The top 4 teams using 4.03 subs a game on average, while the bottom 4 teams use 4.59. And there has rarely been a correlation between the number of subs used and league positions. In 2014, Jonathan Liew did a study for The Telegraph, which examined the behaviour of Premier League managers and found that Brendan Rodgers, whose Liverpool side had finished 2nd in the league that year and scored over 100 goals in the process, was among those to have used the least amount of available subs. Gary Monk and Sam Allardyce, whose Swansea and West Ham sides finished on 42 and 40 points respectively, were among those to have used the most. It's perhaps no surprise that Sean Dyche, one of the most vocal opponents of the 5 subs, was the clear outlier, using fewer than 70% of the subs available to him. Another study by The Telegraph 8 years later in March 2022 also had some interesting findings, particularly when it came to Pep Guardiola and Man City, who possessed the most expansive group of quality players in England. It found that in the 21-22 season up to that point, Pep City had the least number of subs, even fewer than Dyche's Burnley, and that Norwich, who stayed glued to the bottom of the table for most of the campaign, had made the second most behind Brentford, who like the Canaries were newly promoted that campaign. Watford, who also went down, made the 4th most. Interestingly, Guardiola has always been quite conservative when it comes to switching players mid-game, with the same study finding that since his arrival in the Premier League in 2016-17, only Crystal Palace and Burnley had used all 3 available substitutions, fewer times than Manchester City out of the clubs to have remained in the top flight during that time. Southampton, who between 16-17 and 21-22 racked up by far the smallest net spend of the clubs in question, used 3 subs more than any other side bar Tottenham and Chelsea. So higher spending doesn't necessarily mean using more subs. However, this is all in context of managers being limited to 3. We're unlikely to see the full extent of what having 2 extras will look like for a few years when clubs have had time to fully adapt, but it could be profound. As Tifo's Seb Stafford Blur wrote in 2020, whilst 3 subs provides cover for an injury or 2 or a couple of changes necessitated by the score, 5 would allow for the redesign of an entire department, potentially all at once, and with the capacity to reset the change later in the game. If a manager decides that their initial game plan isn't working and needs drastic change, they could feasibly make 5 subs at half time, or make 3 at half time with the knowledge that if they don't work, there's still 2 more opportunities to make changes. And this could of course mean revamping an entire midfield, changing the entire shape of the team periodically throughout the match, or bringing in a player with specific attributes. For example, an incredibly tall striker to unsettle the opposition for a short period before bringing them off again. These are of course things that managers have done in the past, but having 5 substitutes make them far more likely to happen with greater frequency. And while financial power won't be the single defining factor for clubs that benefit from the change, it would be naive to think that it won't play a role. Given their wasteful spending over the last 9 years, a club like Manchester United may be expected to adapt slowly, but Liverpool and Man City, who have used analytics and extensive scouting systems and world-class coaching to pull away from the chasing pack in recent seasons, stand to benefit. For one, squad rotation may become less of an issue from game to game, with star players able to be brought off earlier and top quality squad players given more time to make their mark in the second half. While Guardiola has been increasingly conservative on making changes mid-game, he often changes lineup match to match. 5 subs could see him change course, preserving squad fitness through rotation within games rather than between them. But whether this would help or hinder his game plans remain to be seen. So it won't be spending power alone that dictates success with the new rule. Rather, clubs that not only have the resources but also the intelligence to build squads that can also exploit the change will stand to benefit the most. The emergence of data and analytics as a major force within the game over the last 15 years and its importance in the rise of more cost-efficient clubs like Brentford is evidence of this. What's more, the timing and nature of substitutions is an aspect of the game that has also been affected by these developments. As clubs are permitted to make more of them, analytics departments will be working hard to see how best to utilise them. But as Klopp says, this change may just be necessary to deal with a growing football calendar. From 2024, the Champions League is expanding to 36 teams and participants will need to play more fixtures, while the World Cup is expanding to 48 teams from 2026 and FIFA is still discussing whether to make it happen every 2 years. As the aforementioned James Ollie wrote in June, rather than admitting there is too much football, a law change has been implemented to allow more people to play it. And that's how we think 5 substitutes will change the Premier League forever. If you have any suggestions or you think there's other reasons why it will change football, then let us know in the comments below and we'll see you next time.